All right, so output bias. So that's the background. Widespread, pervasive, very serious levels of ecological degradation around the globe. And the market economy overproduces and overgrows. This is both in any common sense notion of the word, in relationship to the ecological system, and even on its own terms, the pure terms of the model. So it is exceeding an optimal level of, on the one hand, I'm going to show you output growth through labor market dynamics and also through dynamics in the goods market. So output bias in the labor market, too many hours of work, too little translation of productivity gains into leisure. Output bias in the goods market, consumption competitions leading to excessive consumption of status goods relative to human well-being and planetary health. So here we just have a little background. Per capita spending in the United States in constant dollars, we've had almost a tripling, 2.5+ times since 1960 in the average amount of consumption per person in the United States. As we know, a big part of the story here, though, was the growing maldistribution of this consumption. So, the average tells us one thing, relevant for issues of ecology, and this argument, of course, I'm missing out on the other. Here's a picture of hours of work. Actually, this one would be lower if we corrected for under and unemployment, but what we see is a long-term increase in the average annual hours of work by people in the labor force. So this is market hours of work, paid work, and it's annual. A lot of the increase has come in a greater number of weeks worked per year. There's some movement, particularly for some groups on the weekly hours, but the bigger increases have been in the total hours per year. All right, so the ecological, almost all of the ecological debate is about this. It's about new technologies to intervene here to reduce ecological impact. So if you think about the whole climate debate, it's all about technology. We've got to shift to a different energy system, which of course we do, and virtually all of it is on that. We have not yet begun to discuss the scale of consumption and production, which is absolutely central to understanding the ecological problem. Now, if we did, one of the things we'd notice is that we've been in a system which productivity growth, instead of being translated into shorter hours of work, which is, you can take your productivity growth and you can produce the same amount in fewer hours, or you can produce more and keep your hours fixed. I mean, basically two key directions. If you think about the way market economies worked from the early days of capitalism, you had big increases in hours of work, and that's very typical of an emerging market economy. Eventually, you get to the point where workers start to organize, they start to push back on this, they eventually start to use the state. Sometimes firms want to use the state to get hours down because things are getting out of control, and you have a reversal of that. And in the last quarter of the 19th century in the United States and in Western Europe as well, you start to get big pressures to take productivity growth and translate it into shorter hours. And so you have a big reduction in hours of work. In the United States, that pretty much stops after the Second World War, and you get much more fixity in hours and the translation of that productivity growth into increased income. Europe continues on this trajectory of declining hours, and of course now we have a very large gap in annual hours of work between Western Europeans and Americans, more than 300, 400 hours a week. So what happens here then is you have this productivity growth translated into fixed hours, rising output, which turns into income and consumption, ecological impact. Now, why do you have this fixity of hours? The standard, sort of within the model, it's an informational asymmetry. And that's efficiency wage theory and so forth. But I think, and to get back to Steve's point, so the answer to that is more market. You need more complete contracts and you'll solve this problem. In fact, these are not the kinds of problems that can be, you can't write a complete enough contract to cover work effort. And my argument is that it's that incompleteness of that worker-firm relationship that necessitates the use of labor hours as a kind of disciplining device. And that's, I can get more into that if people want to go into it in the questions. I've written about it. But there are other things, the way benefits are paid and so forth. Some of those could be changed. But in any case, we've got a big bias in the way our labor market works, and this has been characteristic of all labor markets. And the thing which has, thank you, the thing which has typically, if you look historically, solved this problem has been worker organization on the one hand through unions and activities to reduce those upward pressures on working hours that come from the normal operations of labor markets in capitalist economies. So if you want to deal with this, if you're thinking about the ecological impact here, what you need to do is start moving this productivity growth into shorter hours of work, which then lowers ecological impact. You also then will have your technological change. You're asking technology to do much too much to solve the ecological problem given where we're at right now. And I would say one other thing, since we're in the midst of an economic collapse, the length and severity of which we don't know, but it certainly doesn't look good from the perspective of March 2009, it's very hard to think about how this economy is going to be able to generate enough jobs to employ its population, a growing population, given what's happening in the global economy and our relative position in the global economy going forward over the next decade or so, if we don't get back to a path of reducing hours per job, because we got off that path, and so it makes it much more difficult for the economy to be able to generate enough jobs if we maintain so many high hours or what I call long hours jobs. So basically reducing hours per job, which will end up in also typically people working shorter hours, I think has to be absolutely key to any serious long-term recovery plan. Okay, I want to say something about consumption competitions because it's a different kind of mechanism. It's not about the relationship between firms and workers, which is what's driving those hours decisions, but this is purely among workers in their other guise as consumers, so economic agents or consumers. Given that consumption is a social process, Steve talked about some of the assumptions in the neoclassical model, unlimited wants. One of the other key assumptions is the absence of interdependent preferences. So what one person consumes doesn't affect another person's preferences. And so you don't have, it's an asociality in consumption that's amazing when you think about it, because every other discipline thinks about consumption as fundamentally a social process, not just anthropologists and sociologists.